Well, I guess I should have known that we would always get to this point, and I've mentioned it a couple of times, but I've never gone um, too deep into it because I just wasn't sure that it would be okay with the YouTube censors. But at this point, the lab leak hypothesis has totally reached the mainstream of America. The corporate press is talking about it. Fauci triggered this by coming out in an interview and saying over the weekend, I believe it was, that he's not totally convinced that that the Wu flu, as we were calling it last year, the coronavirus, the COVID-19, as they cringily named it, pretty late into the game, that virus, he's not convinced originated in a natural evolutionary way. In other words, the grand poobah of science TM now thinks that there is a case to be made for intelligent design in this particular instance. Now, this is not any big revelation to me, of course, or to anyone else who was following this back in starting in January of 2020. Those of us who watched Chris Martenson every night, who, by the way, is still great. He's back in the game. If you guys don't subscribe to Peaks of Prosperity, you guys should go over and do that. He's a great guy. I've followed Chris for many years, and that's why I knew before almost anybody that this virus was going to be a big deal. And thankfully, the virus is not nearly as bad as we thought. But, those of us who really focused on this early on, when this was just a problem in Wuhan, we have been saying this for a very long time, because if you focused on this when this was just a problem in Wuhan, you thought of it in terms of, okay, hey, we have the Wu flu, this Wuhan virus. We don't know what it is, but we know that it started here. So we thought we had to think critically. Okay, let's look at what's going on in Wuhan. Where could this virus have originated? And according to the Chinese government, it originated at what they called a wet market in the Western press. This is, an open air meat market where they had fish and other animals, and probably people's beloved pet dogs and things like that. And we were told that it was the horrible eating habits of these terrible, no good, bad Chinese people who just love to gorge themselves on bat soup that led to this virus jumping species from bats to humans. But since this was the Chinese government's official story, well, you kind of have to take that with a grain of salt and think, okay, what else could this have happened? We know that Chinese people have been eating bats for a long time, at least since the Great Leap Forward, which is why you have a lot of weird foods that are eaten in China, a lot of weird animals like, stray dogs and cats. It's because during the Great Leap Forward and under Mao, Chinese people were starving and they had to eat whatever they could get their hands on, kind of like how in North Korea, people have to eat the skinny rats that are themselves malnourished because there's not any food that, that the humans leave behind, because there's just not a lot of food in general in North Korea. And so kind of like how you have weird French cuisine like eating snails that originated from people being in extreme poverty, you have, a similar thing in China. And they eat bats and all sorts of other things. But that has never led to any problems before. Bat coronaviruses have existed for a very long time, and bat coronaviruses just so happen to have been actively studied at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and I believe there was one other lab which had come under scrutiny, as I've talked about in the past. You could find news articles for a long time, they've probably been scrubbed by now, talking about the safety problems at these labs. And there was also, stuff here and there about gain-of-function research, research that was potentially being funded by the National Institute of Health, which, of course, was led by one Dr. Anthony Fauci. There was also a case of some Chinese doctors who had stolen some, I believe they were coronavirus samples from a lab in Canada, and potentially had made their way back to Wuhan. And again, I'm just kind of going over this briefly because this was a year ago that I really studied this closely, and I don't remember all the details of all this different stuff, but my point is to say, We were talking about this a long, long time ago, and it seemed pretty clear, this might seem a little more likely than just the idea that randomly, finally, after eating bats for however long, the Chinese people finally got sick. And they got really, really, really sick. But this had never happened before, even though, bats have carried coronavirus for I don't know how long, very long time. It seemed more likely to me, especially based on what I was reading from. I believe there was some papers published in India by some doctors there, where they were analyzing this coronavirus and saying, gee, it looks like part of the genome was just sort of spliced in here and was copied and pasted from AIDS. And so that led to Mr. Mediocre, which I loved watching his streams on this back in the day before he got canned by YouTube. He did some great Wu Flu streams, and he coined the phrase "airborne AIDS," which again, back then we were a lot of us, we took this virus very seriously, in that we thought it was going to be like absolutely nuts, and it thankfully was not that bad. But again, the origins and stuff, it's not that hard to put the pieces together. And it was only a matter of time before the science TM acknowledged that the lab leak was in fact reality. After all, the Chinese regime is still a big enemy of the American regime. There might be a lot of people who have ties to China in the American government who, maybe want to be a little softer on China than some other folks. But at the end of the day, they still have an interest in slandering the Chinese. Or even, I shouldn't say slander implies that it's unfair. They have an interest in besmirching the name of the Chinese, both fairly and unfairly. And if the Chinese really, if there was a possibility that they screwed up this badly, or worse, sort of did this maliciously, which that wasn't something I never believed, but I'll get to that in a second. The United States government, I would find it very surprising if they never went after China for this, at least rhetorically. Now, I don't think that this is necessarily, I think that one potential explanation for why the lab leak hypothesis was just so brutally beaten down and smeared and suppressed last year was because that would make this more of a national security great power game sort of news story rather than a story about public health. And it's no mystery, or it's no secret that Republicans, specifically Donald Trump, poll much better when it comes to national security stuff and U.S.-China relations than Democrats, specifically Joe Biden, who the Trump campaign was kind of trying to smear as a Chinese puppet, either fairly or unfairly, that's up to you, but that was what they were going for. And so turning the focus onto China would be an advantage to Trump and a disadvantage to Biden. Moreover, Democrats generally are regarded as, they're regarded better on healthcare matters and public health because Democrats are nice and cuddly, and that's something that also, Trump was considered particularly bad on. Again, I'm just talking whether you think that's fair or unfair. That was just general public perception. And so if you wanted to spin the news in an anti-Trump manner, which, of course, the U.S. corporate media was very anti-Trump in 2020 and throughout his entire presidency, that's no secret, that's not a conspiracy theory, that's just a fact, it's obvious. It would make sense that they would spin the news in this kind of a story in the manner to be the most unfavorable towards Trump and the most favorable for Biden possible. And now that Trump is out of the way, maybe the truth can start to come out. Now, I'm not going to say that's 100% the issue. I don't know, because this sort of messaging gets disseminated from the bureaucracy. You have to remember that the corporate press takes their marching orders. They're not. I don't agree with people who think that the press, that the media is driving American politics in any sense. I tend to take much more of a manufactured consent sort of perspective in that, or sort of a post-Mockingbird sort of perspective in that the media, the corporate press, acts as agents of the state, perpetuating the narrative that the state is looking to go with, and that these people are stenographers. They're not pulling the strings in Washington. Washington is pulling their strings. But with that said, the permanent bureaucracy in Washington, hated Trump as much, if not more, than the corporate press themselves. So, I mean, it's a toss-up here. It's sort of a chicken or the egg thing. And I don't want to say that this was all about Trump and that that's why the lab leak hypothesis was concealed. But considering the focus and the emphasis that the media puts on Trump, and the way in which, when Trump was president, all news stories were put through sort of a Trump lens. That's how they looked at everything. It was pathological. It's impossible for me to ignore the Trump angle of this and not look at it through that perspective, because that's how they would have seen it. But again, there's also the matter that, from Fauci's perspective, just on a pure self-interest standpoint, I do not see why he would want to perpetuate the lab leak hypothesis or give any air to it at all, considering that there was the rumors going around with that, and sort of the implications were that the National Institute of Health, in their collaboration with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, might have had some kind of a hand in this gain-of-function research that eventually led to the lab leak, which released this virus. So it makes me think that if Fauci is willing to say it now, he must feel that his hands are totally clean, and that the National Institute of Health has nothing to hide in that respect, or he's confident enough that the U.S. will be able to spin this so that it's all China's fault, and that the U.S. involvement in no way contributed to the development of this artificial, to a certain extent, virus. The other thing is the matter of China. Even if the administration is not, as I said, the U.S. government is never going to be pro-China. Even if they have by American standards, sort of pro-Chinese guy like Joe Biden, the state overall, the state's interests are in opposition, sort of run counter to China's goals of becoming a more of a regional power in Asia. Because remember, the American regime still controls most of Asia. We control the Pacific and those waters, and that's why the Chinese are trying to inch a little bit and say, hey, we're going to assert control over the South China Sea. That's a very small first step towards them trying to assert some regional power in East Asia. And so it's not out of the question, again, as I said, that this lab leak narrative could be pushed by what is, nominally a pro-Chinese administration in Washington. But I don't think that they would want to. But still, it might be going a little too far, because it would shift focus towards China and away from Russia. And it seems to me like the Democrats have wanted to, each of the major parties, Republicans and the Democrats, have painted their big boogeyman in the sky. And for quite a few years, the Republicans' boogeyman was Putin and Russia. Once the Democrats started, painting the Republicans all as Russian stooges, and they very quickly pivoted and decided China was the big enemy. And, at least that seems a little more reasonable. I mean, Russia's not much of a threat to the United States. I think that's a little absurd. But it does seem weird. I mean, if this narrative really takes off, which again, it's a pretty powerful one. Once people start to hear about it, they think, wait, this virus was made in a lab by the Chinese, or potentially by Fauci. That's a pretty intoxicating narrative. It's not it's quite sexy as far as news stories go. So they do run the risk, if this really takes off, that China, in the minds of even Americans on the left, who, remember, are the ones who are the most concerned about the virus and are the most hysterical about it, if they associate this virus with China, well, China could eclipse Russia in the minds of all Americans, and not just Republicans, because again, very quickly Republicans pivoted away from Russia towards only really worrying about China. Well, if Fauci comes out and says, hey, China might have created this virus, then the entire left half of America is going to be deathly afraid of the Chinese. And so how at that point could the Democrats continue to use Russia as their big boogeyman if even their own voters are, scared, hiding inside of their own homes, wearing masks out while they're jogging because they're afraid of China? So I guess in closing, I'm kind of in wait-and-see mode to see where this goes. Now then again, Fauci's the kind of guy who throws out a lot of trial balloons, and they're not subtle. He'll just sort of come out there and say something one day, and then he could do a total 180 the next day, depending on how people start to react to that, depending on how the media starts to, depending on how the news cycle starts to form. He could decide, what, I don't like the way this is going. I'm gonna say the exact opposite and reel you guys back in. And so he could just it's sort of similar to Trump in that respect, where Trump would just come out and he would just say stuff. And you couldn't necessarily read too much into it, because he just would just say it and see, like, oh, let's see how that goes over. And if it didn't go over well, he'd backtrack. Like that one time that Trump, he said after a school shooting or something, he said, you take the guns first, due process later. And the backlash was universal scorn on the right, and like, oh my God, Trump, what are you, nuts? Shut the hell up. And then Trump's like, you know what? Due process first. We like that. And he very quickly backtracked. So maybe, Fauci sort of does a similar thing where he's like, this virus, did it come from a lab? Did it come from bats in a wet market? I don't know. Hey. And if he decides he likes that news cycle, he'll keep saying that. And if he likes the way that the media is reacting to that, if he likes the way that people are perceiving what he said, he'll keep saying that. Kind of like when he came out and he said, hey, double masks, it's just common sense, right? Hey. And then, like a week later, he's like, what? Double masks? That doesn't do nothing. Nobody's proven that. What are you, schmuck? So I think, we need to wait and see if the regime continues to sort of feed into this narrative. And again, maybe it's, they might get to the point to where this takes on a life of its own and they're not able to reel it back in. But again, so far I have not heard anyone in the establishment try and reel this narrative back in and say, no, that lab leak stuff, Fauci was just kidding about that. There's no possibility that you're a conspiracy theorist if you even ask the question. I've not heard that. So we'll have to see what their angle is on this and where it goes from here. And so I expect to do, maybe in the next couple of weeks, another update on this, just to see how it turns out, because, it's too soon to tell right now.